The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM in Baton Rouge. Figured I'd go ahead and repeat that since I cut the station ID off a little bit early. But anyway, we're glad to have you here, and before we get kicked off here, I'd like to remind you that this is a live call-in show. You are welcomed to call and encouraged to call with your comments and questions, particularly if you disagree with me or Lang Baker. Lang is here again tonight. How you doing, Lang?
Doing great. How are you?
We'd like to hear from you. 343-9927, 343-9927. And tonight's topic deals with ownership of America's media, basically sources of information. They point out, just like you said here, in 1975 the number of media outlets has indeed increased, but at the same time ownership has become more concentrated, and today there is less diversity of opinion and less diversity of news sources than in 1975. And it states that the increased market power of a sharply declining number of corporate voices has led to negative externalities as well, with media conglomerates stressing profit maximization over concerns of localism and diversity.
All right. And so there's also, with the consolidation of ownership, a lot of automation of what goes out over the airwaves, and a loss of local news event coverage and things like that, where everything's coming from one central point. Like what used to be Clearwater, they changed their name. I don't remember what it is now, but they own like 1,200 stations or something like that. And so you're not going to have much of the local reporter on the local beat telling what's happening in your hometown on the station owned by Clearwater that's run out of some corporate office.
Right. Well,
location.
Yeah, and of course it says here in the little clip I read from PBS, it's news feeds that the conglomerates own. It's not the local stations and all that, but that's where the local stations get a lot of their stuff. And I recall somebody complaining years ago about they no longer tell you if it's 5 after 2 where you live, they no longer give you the time in. It's 5 minutes after 2 o'clock, on such and such radio here and there. They say it's 5 minutes after the hour because they're broadcasting all over the country, and it may be a different hour, where other people are hearing it. But
right.
But everybody in the country is hearing the same thing.
Right.
And there was that clip. You said that you saw a post on Facebook a ways back where 7 or 8 different local news stations, television stations, put up the same graphics and told the same story, read almost the same script.
Reading the same script,
because they're all getting a satellite feed from some major corporation. But also, I wanted to clarify something. Did you say the fairness doctrine was what required the two...
There used to be a fairness doctrine back when I was a kid. It was the FCC rule, as I understand. It wasn't written into statute, I don't think.
Okay, but
I think that went out with Reagan, during the Reagan years.
But did it have something specifically to do with the two stations sharing the spectrum, or was that just how they handle it? Right.
It had to do with presenting alternative points of view.
Right. Okay, cool.
Fairness in the subject being presented, not the stations.
Okay. All right. So have you seen any differences in coverage? I mean, what would be what's the problem with this reduced or consolidation of ownership? I mean, I can come up with a few. I'm giving you first shot at it, though.
Well, on one level is what I was referring to earlier about the loss of local coverage. But then on another level, there's controlling of the agenda and what gets covered and what's considered newsworthy and what's not. And there's both the omission of covering things, and this started from what I recall with the rise of the opposition to the Vietnam War and the rise of the consumerism movement and what Ralph Nader did, and so there was a decision on the part of the editors of a lot of newspapers in the country that they just weren't going to cover that stuff anymore.
Interesting.
And so if you couldn't get the coverage, of course, then you're limited in the number of people that are going to hear about these issues.
And these were local
These were the national newspapers
Okay, the nationals,
that
yeah.
report out of D.C. and things like that. And
Of course.
when one of the organizations or another would issue a report or a study and be advocating for things, changes in the law to address problems that they were revealing, that they just wouldn't get covered.
Yeah, and I remember the, was it the San Jose Mercury, Sun Mercury, that published a story way back in the early 80s, I think, about the DEA being involved in the drug trade in Central America and a lot of that the cocaine coming up here.
Something like that, I don't know.
Yeah,
the
there was
details.
involvement in, and the San Jose Mercury, Sun Mercury published that story, and the rest of the media shot him down, and all the journalists, shunned him. And apparently it was a true story, but it got buried, and the guy ended up committing suicide. I mean,
Yeah.
the journalist did.
Yeah.
But it's interesting you mentioned how things began changing after Vietnam. That-
Vietnam and the rise of consumer movements and the Earth Day movement. And,
I hadn't thought about that, but
public
yeah,
movements.
I was thinking it was just, well, I guess the Vietnam War was the first lesson, and I discussed this a long time back on this show with a Vietnam combat vet and a Vietnam-era veteran and activist. During the Vietnam War, they had journalists that had free range out there. They would get off and go with a squad or whatever out into the jungle and see things firsthand, take pictures and write about it and send it back home. And they're the ones that broke the story about the lies and the body counts and all that and all the other things going on. But yet, after that, I mean, Nixon was incensed by a lot of this coverage, and I think Johnson too was angry. In fact, he claimed that the media people ruined him. But that was real journalism. I mean, those guys were out there, just like was it Ernie Pyle? I guess it was, that famous World War II journalist that was out there on the front lines, getting shot at right along with the fight of the men. But then we have the Iraq War, which we talked about on that show, where the media made a big thing about embedded journalists, and as it turns out, a couple of the Iraq War veterans, combat veterans, said they had their media correspondent with them only half the time, and the other half it was with the other part of the unit, and they understood that when the media correspondent was not with them, they could pretty much do what they wanted to, and they did, and the same thing happened in Vietnam, too, but of course the My Lai massacre ended up getting published, although I think they minimized how much carnage there actually was with that. But the reporters got the story out anyway. But there was that, and then I was remembering the run-up to the Iraq War when George W. Bush had his closed-door meeting with congressional Democrats, after which those leaders agreed to support the law to give him the power to go to war in Iraq. And all they did was say, today there was a closed-door session with Democratic leaders, and afterward they decided to support going to war. Where was the outrage about this being a public meeting with public officials and no media were present?
Right.
But yet they just seemed to gloss over that. It didn't even seem to bother them. Nobody even mentioned it.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder if that's part of all this dominance of our media by a big money interest.
I would tend to think there's a lot of different dimensions of how the consolidation of media and the power of media has weakened democracy by weakening the flow of information to the public, where they can have all the facts and discuss among the public what, like what I was describing earlier, was just the media deciding not to coverage. But then there's also media disinformation campaigns from so-called approved leaks from government, like the stuff that was published in the New York Times before the Iraq War that was completely false.
It's completely false, yeah.
And then there's the strong-arm tactics by some interests to keep things out of the media, like the case of David Koch influencing the PBS to spike their airing of the documentary Citizen Koch. And that's because Koch have donated like $23 million to public television, so they've got kind of leverage there that, to kind of twist the arm and prevent the airing of things that they would find
offensive or
embarrassing or whatever.
Yep. There, I'm also reminded of the TWA Flight 800 story back in the late 90s, I think it was. It was it was the late 90s, because I was doing a radio show in Alexandria at the time, and this was I think it was an Israeli airliner. Israeli Airlines plane took off from LaGuardia, and 10 minutes after it took off, it blew up in midair. And it happened at night. And I remember I was a right-wing libertarian zealot at the time, and I was seeing all these stories in the propaganda I was reading, saying that there were eyewitnesses that said they saw a flare-like, thing arcing up from the ocean and toward the plane, and then the plane blew up. And later on, they began finding debris, and I remember seeing a story where a piece of a seat cushion was discovered and analyzed by a private entity, and they found explosive residue, and they sent it to a CBS journalist, and before she had a chance, they sent it to her to have it independently analyzed, and before she could get it done, the FBI found out about it and sent some people up and confiscated it, and it never got released by any of the major media. And it turned out, from what I've been able to find through alternative means, that the Navy had been conducting exercises off the coast of the U.S. up around that area at the time, and I forget what they called it, but it was the flight path that was supposed to come over where they were operating was shut down for airline traffic, and this airliner was in an adjacent lane, and it's believed that a Navy ship accidentally or mistakenly shut it down, shot down the plane. But this was all, completely covered up. It never made it out to public. In fact, the CIA produced a video showing that it wasn't a flare-like thing going up to the plane that eyewitnesses claimed to see. It was the nose of the plane. When the plane blew in half, the nose arced upward. And, everybody's like, come on, you kidding me? But the long story short, or actually long story long, GE owned CBS at the time, I believe. And they had major contracts with the federal government, so it was easy to get them to stifle the story. It just never went anywhere.
Yeah, they're a big defense contractor.
Yeah, they're a big defense contractor. So there's that money link there. And, boy, I just remember, look at the two guys with Watergate, Leonard Bernstein and Bob Woodward. I mean, that was pure American investigative journalism. They went in there and investigated all these things and found all these crimes committed by the White House plumbers associated with Richard Nixon, and they brought down his presidency. I don't think we'll see that today. What do you think?
I'm not very good at predicting the future. It all depends on what kind of wild cards you have. I mean, what they got was information from an insider who was willing to leak.
Good point. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. So there's no telling. I read their book, but that was way long ago when I was a young man, and I've since forgotten all the details. But the FCC, the Federal Communications Act, even now, I believe, charges the agency with maximizing the public interest. This is a quote now: the public interest, convenience, or necessity of the American people to access to information through the airways and other media now. Of course, it's gone to the internet.
Right.
But with this consolidation, there are a lot of people who think that it's become more about earning money. And as I understand it, as they have consolidated ownership, they've laid off a lot of journalists to where they don't really dig into things and find anything out. And
Yeah, because consolidation, they're looking at the bottom line there and viewing it as a profit machine. And one way to cut costs is to cut back on journalists, and especially investigative journalism, which takes a lot longer time view of the results you get for the money you put into it.
yeah, yeah, and I remember Al Jazeera America, when they were on the air here, they had a lot of good investigative journalism, and they would publish stories that you just wouldn't hear of in America. And I couldn't help but notice that there were no major corporate entities advertising on the TV. They had a lot of these fly-by-night cures, for looking younger and stuff like that. All these quack things on there. But because then I suspect it's because no major corporate interest in America would support them. And probably based on where they were operated from or owned from, they probably went out of business when oil prices dropped. They were probably subsidizing the whole thing with oil profits. But China Global Television Network now is also very good. They're comparable to Al Jazeera, but they have real investigative journalists. They ask real questions of their guests on their panels and everything, and they probe deeply and don't let people get away with the nonsense and the quaint replies that our media seem to let people get away with.
Yeah, well, and one angle on that is the one impediment to the large media corporations in this country doing investigative journalism is the interests that will be injured by the results of their investigation. Who, just like the example we referred to with GE and
Yeah.
is possible influence there. So they're not going to go investigate something that's going to offend the bosses up at the top of the corporate ladder. And I suspect you wouldn't find your China television doing a lot of investigative journalism about what's going on inside of China.
Oh, no,
It's
no,
their,
I don't mean...
It's their
yes.
interest to do investigative journalism of subjects they want to criticize.
Yeah.
And it's good if if their investigations are sound for the people who receive
Right, and
those results.
And what I've seen with them so far is that they are honest discussions. They're not really skewed one way or the other. However, of course, they probably do choose topics that enlightening people about them would be in their interest. But I don't see that necessarily as a bad thing. I mean, at least something. You can pick through it and pick up a glimmer of a few things. I've seen plenty of nonsense on TV, and I think I can recognize it. And this is a sophisticated network that explores a lot of issues and talks about a lot of other countries too, and not just America and the countries that we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. It just they seem to be investing, and again, they're largely a state-owned or government-owned thing, so they have the revenues to put into it. But that's something I was thinking about too. People worry about the government's public broadcasting system and all that stuff, and how they don't want the government owning our media. But do we really want corporate America owning everything too? Shouldn't there be a balance, like everything else in nature?
Well, actually, I think it'd be helpful if we had more publicly supported, like this station,
Yeah.
where we're answerable to and speaking to our own local community.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree, but here again, look how hard it is for entities like us to get money, because most people will go for the easier thing, the corporate media or whatever, and because that's readily available, they're very entertaining, they don't tell people too many things they don't want to hear. And that was one thing that our programming director here at the station mentioned to me when I was thinking about doing a show last year, starting this one, was that we don't have any big money donors who are concerned about what we put out. They want us to put out information, our small donors, regular citizens and all that. So this station can pretty much say whatever it wants within the FCC's guidelines on obscenity and stuff like that. And I like that, because I like saying things. In fact, I want to point out again that regardless of what happens with the Alton Sterling story, I'd still like to see or know what happened to the body cam footage of the two officers whose camcorders fell off their bodies, right before the confrontation. So, I'd like to see that. But anyway, getting back to the profit motive, though, that according to this EPI, this Economic Policy Institute book review, they pretty much ends up, instead of being in the public interest, it's in the interest of the advertisers, which generate most of the revenue, and they want it targeted toward a particular market in, local areas. And that's going to be people with money, probably, Therefore, people without much money don't get much coverage, if anything, and except when they commit crimes.
Yeah, they get coverage when it's beneficial to portray them as something to fear.
Yeah, something to fear, and that other, yeah. Because hey, that's good business too, right? Anyway, I've been neglecting my responsibility to remind the listeners you can call in. This is the Pause for Thought. You can call in 343-9927, 343-9927. We're talking about the consolidation of the ownership of American media and how that can be affecting us. And Lang, you got a paper up?
Well, I was just going to brings back to that act in 1996 Communications Act, that Telecommunications Act, that opened the door for this consolidation. It was promoted as something to promote competition, but in fact it ended up doing exactly the opposite of reducing the competition by all this consolidation that occurred in the wake of that. And like so many things that are decided in the halls of Congress, money calls the tune. In 2014, the cable and satellite providers spent over $8 million on lobbying in that 1 year. And you can bet that they're going to be on top of what's coming right around the corner, which is the next big grab, and that's the internet and the whole net neutrality issue. Just this past Monday, Trump named Ajit Pai to head the FCC, and he is a strong advocate for abolishing the net neutrality rule, which what that does is allow the providers like Comcast and Verizon to give preferential delivery to some customers and slow it down for others. So that's what their $8 million in 2014, and no telling how much it's going to be in this year ahead.
Yeah,
it's going to be directed at implementing.
Yeah, but isn't that the free market?
No, that's not the free market. That's the bought and paid for market.
Well, yeah, but I mean,
nothing free about it.
No, and well, yeah, you and I agree on that, and but yeah, you mentioned earlier before we went on the air about the polarization of America.
Yeah, there was a study that came out. When did that come out? Just in 2015. In September, so that's just a little over a year ago. A study at the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University. And what they looked at was the changing attitudes of Americans in polarization on political issues, comparing it to before 96 and after 96. And what their research showed was that citizens in this country have become increasingly polarized since 1996, and the greater use of TV news had a positive correlation with the level of polarization.
Okay, yeah.
So it's like with the consolidation that occurred in 96, the information flow to the public is promoting a sense of our side's right and your side's wrong, and there's no bridging the gap.
No,
instead of an open conversation about the policy issues.
You just reminded me that I started my show in Alexandria in 96, in the second half of 96, and that was when Fox News was just gaining its foothold. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, they're gaining their market share by appearing to be the
Fair
antithesis.
and balanced.
Well, fair and balanced, yeah. But they appear to be the opposite of the so-called liberal media. But I had already figured out by that point that the so-called liberal media were not really liberal. They're good at appearing that way, but the information they do not provide people is always serves the money. It serves power, and so But yeah, I remember that. I was thinking they're actually appealing nowadays anyway with the different news shows or pseudo news shows and all that on TV. They're appealing to a niche audience. They're all trying to grab their little piece of the opinion pie, and it has atomized, it has separated us and polarized the country. I think that's obvious now, and of course, we have polarized the Congress too at this point. So anyway, we got to go, Lang. As usual, it's always interesting talking with you and getting ready for these shows. You've been listening to A Pause for Thought with Wayne Parker Lang Baker here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. We've got to go. We thank you for listening. Have a good evening.